Well, I did a Bachelor of Science leading into a teaching degree. I got my Diploma of Education and went into the schools as a science teacher. Um, you know, and in hindsight, I have put together the fact that I was actually in the schools at a very interesting time because I started in 1986 in the high schools and taught there till the early 2000s. And if you might know, most people might know now that in 1986 was a very significant thing happened in the US. And it was that year that Ronald Reagan passed the law that removed liability from all the pharmaceutical companies for any that produced harm. And so from 1986 onwards, you will notice that the program began to expand rapidly with all sorts of that have not been used by our generation. And you'll know that the risk of infectious diseases in Australia had actually been removed by 1950. So people were being conned into this idea that you needed to control these diseases, and yet the risk had been removed by 1950. I mean, that's a key fact that people need to know. By risk, we don't mean that the disease was removed. These are ecological diseases. These microorganisms live in our environment. The risk was removed by balancing the environment. So it was the public health reforms that many people know about now. The sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, smaller family sizes, all of those things had improved in developed countries by 1950. And all the public health, you can go back in the literature, all the public health officials state that the risk of infectious diseases was only thought of in developing countries by that time. And that's why it's critical that each country designs their own public health policy. And that was another thing I found in my research was that, which really surprised me, it hadn't occurred to me that Australia wasn't designing our own public health policy. Okay, so that's an issue we'll bring up later. So from the schools, by the early 1990s, I started having my own children and I was teaching science in the high schools. And my second son did have a reaction to one of the DTP. And by this time, I'd also seen the number of on the program as well, and had questioned why there were so many now when we had one or two, and they weren't even compulsory, by the way. Even when you had one or two, most of them were voluntary. So most of them prior to 1990 were only a 50% or less uptake because it was only voluntary. So from 1990 onwards, we had this issue of the expanded program, and in the schools, I was on the front line. We were seeing this huge increase in ADHD, asthma, allergies, autism, speech delay, autoimmune diseases. And in the mid-1990s, the principal of our schools started saying, well, he was going off to this meeting and all the principals are wondering what's causing this increase in illness. And then you'll know by the 2000s, teachers had to have EpiPens. And we were starting to see signs of kids in staff rooms of, people with allergies to be aware of in the playground. The students that were allergic. And of course, I might put in here a fact. In 1913, Charles Rickett won the Nobel Prize for discovering that the causal link of allergies and anaphylaxis. So there's no surprise that this increase in anaphylaxis and allergies, it occurred right across the 1990s, and the huge increase in chronic illness in children until today, where we have in all developed countries, 50% of children are now the sickest generation we've had yet, and 50% of them have chronic illnesses or life-threatening illnesses, and parents have become full-time carers. So after my son had a reaction, I was put on to Vera Scheibner's research on the DTP vaccine, and she was giving talks around the country in 1994, 95. And then I would see media articles stating, oh no, that's junk science, which alerted me again. I'm a science teacher, I can read scientific articles, and I realized that wasn't true. And then by the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to go back to university to literally do a scientific study of the risk benefit of using all of these in children, and so, I had to go part-time and go back to university, and just simply because I wanted to know if I should be with all these. So I thought it would be straightforward. You'd do a risk-benefit analysis of not just using one in a developing infant, but the 12 that they recommend from day one of life. In fact, now as a fetus in pregnant women, which never used to be the case. And I thought, well, I'd be able to do the research, and that I'd have the answer. But of course, little did I know that the industry lobby groups are very powerful within universities now and all our media institutions. And as soon as I started debating my research, or even bringing up the desire to focus on that through my PhD, I found it was hard to get supervisors. There were obstacles put up everywhere. And, just the very fact that I was there to find the answer prevented these obstacles from stopping me doing the research. I mean, I even applied for a government scholarship to do it, for independent research about children's health, but that was rejected in 2006 when I applied for it. But that wasn't, fortunately my husband was able to provide an income with our 3 children so that I could find that answer and do the research. And ever since it was published, it's, just been smeared in the media, and it's to do with the powerful industry lobby groups we have.
So you weren't expecting that pushback when you first sort of, or were you kind of aware that what you were doing was going to be seen as somewhat controversial in regards to the PhD? Did you already have that sense?
Not at all. I mean, I went to university believing that they were objective institutions where you could research a topic, debate. But I noticed even when I tried to, as a teacher, I know that in tutes and seminars, teachers appreciate people that will speak up and ask questions and provide information. And I felt that I was getting stomped on every time I tried to have a conversation on that topic. And it was definitely, by the time I started to debate it, the internet was full of, I don't know if you've heard of the Australian Skeptics.
I have, yeah.
But they're an organisation that I found out had been set up by Dick Smith as one of the founding members around 1979, 1980. And they based themselves on the Committee of Skeptical Inquiry in the US, which is a committee that promotes corporate interests in government policy. And this organisation had become very powerful. They're mostly lay people, but they use industry-funded scientists to promote their message. And whilst they say they're exposing pseudoscience, they're doing the opposite. They're maintaining the status quo, and they call themselves skeptics, when in fact, they're pro. And they started using this word anti and calling my work controversial. So here I am, mainstream science teacher, mainstream, looking at a risk benefit of a drug that's being given to healthy people, in fact healthy infants in the prime stages of their development, and they're calling my work research controversial. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me when I started to debate it publicly. The media has turned everything upside down, and then they're allowed to dismiss it with this word anti. You're not, just because you talk about the risks of a drug, you're not anti the drug. But when we started to talk about the risks, which are drugs, we then they are then able to dismiss all of our arguments just by calling us anti. When it's scientific method requires that you look at the risk-benefit balance of any drug, because in fact there's no drug that can be called safe in every human being. Basic stuff like that, and yet the media gets away with misinforming the public, using hate speech like anti-conspiracy theories. And I just had to laugh when they called my work controversial, because it's the absolute opposite.